First of all, Robin, welcome to FilmFellas. Thank you very much for joining us. Really, really chuffed and over the moon to have you here. Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody and talk to us about some of these amazing documentaries that you've been doing and tell us more about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Robin Block. I'm the founder and CEO of CREATORVC, and we are a production company, a fundraising company, a distribution company for genre film documentaries and other things. So you may know us from our horror documentary franchise, which is In Search of Darkness. Which is the most successful horror documentary series ever made. And our sci-fi documentary, In Search of Tomorrow, and In Search of the Last Action Heroes, where you can see behind me some of the posters for our work. So really delighted to be here. And I also just want to say, I reached out to FilmFellas when I came across them. The algorithm on YouTube blessed me with what they were doing. And I was like, this is such a cool idea. And I'm grateful that they're having me on.
Well, we're really chuffed that you're here. And having seen In Search of the Last Action Heroes on Amazon Prime, I can really recommend it because I've got to be honest with you, I didn't know that you were involved in it when when we originally spoke, but when you told me, I was like, God, yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was such a massive nostalgia trip for me, and I really highly recommend it. But we're here to talk about Your Forgotten Great, and so why don't you introduce everybody to what is Your Forgotten Great and tell us why you've chosen it.
Repo Man, right? So I've got some props. I can't show you the photos at the moment, but I do have some photos. This book, if you're a film fan, Alex Cox is a really fascinating character, and there's a whole chapter about Repo Man in this book. But I love Repo Man. I first watched it, it must have been when I was in my early teens, and it had such a big impression. And I'm 45 years old now, and I still really enjoy it. It's just such an interesting time capsule of like mid 80s LA with, and it kind of defies genre. It's sci-fi, there's kind of like a buddy movie there's all these sorts of things, but it just kind of works. And I think that occasionally, especially in the 1980s, they threw out films. They were able to sort of blend genres and experiment, and you ended up with a few, pieces of brilliance, which I think this film definitely falls into that category.
Yeah, and I think that genre mixing certainly came across in the 80s, didn't it? It was almost like in the 70s, 60s and 70s, genre was kind of, there's just one genre and you stick to that. But, as we've covered before on FilmFellas, Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark, which is ultimately a Western meets vampire. And, Repo Man definitely falls into that kind of category as well. Alex Cox is interesting as well. So obviously any kind of film geeks in the UK who might be of a similar age in their 40s now will obviously know Alex Cox because he helped us discover a lot of movies. And I remember Trancers and films like that, that you wouldn't necessarily come across, but you were exposed to because of Alex Cox and the series Movie Drone.
Movie Drone was incredible.
Yeah, you a fan of Movie Drone?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when we talked about me coming on, the two films that I suggested were Repo Man, which I don't even know where I was introduced. I could have been introduced to it via Movie Drone, but I definitely was introduced to my other choice, which was Bad Taste. I remember vividly recording on VHS off BBC Two Movie Drone, and I just used to love Alex Cox's introduction to those films. He made them sound really interesting, kind of queued you up. And what's amazing about YouTube now and the kind of film YouTube, the kind of film criticism, is a great YouTube video on a movie, whether you've seen it or not, should excite you about wanting to see that movie. And hopefully from this conversation now, if you haven't seen Repo Man, you should watch it. It's a little bit special.
Well, that gives us a great lead in, Robin, to the plot. So why don't you kind of give us a a non-spoiler, let's whet people's appetites to kind of go off and search and find Repo Man. What the hell is this movie about?
Okay, that's such a difficult question. So it's about, there's all, basically you've got a great MacGuffin in this movie, which is this kind of magical thing that lives inside the boot of this Chevy, I think it's a Chevy Malibu car that is being taken into LA. It's got people chasing it, repo men chasing it, and the film is kind of explored through the eyes of this kind of disgruntled teen called Otto, who is like a punk kid, and the influence of 80s punk. It's got like Black Flag, Iggy Pop did the title song for it. Circle Jerks are in it. So if you're into kind of 80s new wave punk in LA, like it's embedded with that. The plot's really hard to describe because they go on this sort of adventure movie that turns into a sci-fi movie with a government conspiracy and aliens. It just goes a bit crazy, but the way it does it, it doesn't feel like it's gone crazy. It feels real within this kind of world. In a weird way, there's so much authenticity to it. So actually trying to describe the plot is, it on paper you wouldn't think it makes any sense, but when you watch it, it just goes there. It's a bit like a trip.
Brilliant. So we always ask people who come on to talk about their forgotten greats the 3 reasons why we should kind of go off and find this movie, why it's so great. So why don't you talk us over your 3 reasons why people need to check out this movie?
Okay, reason number 1, you need to watch this movie because of Harry Dean Stanton, and his performance is incredible. This film. This is pre-Tarantino. This would have inspired. It's like a movie that could have been a Tarantino movie. The dialogue is so on point and clever. You just want to be there. You want to be a fly on the wall. So Harry Dean Stanton. Number 2, I'm going to say.
Let me just pick you up on. Let's just expand on Harry Dean Stanton for a minute. So, and it's interesting there that you've mentioned 2 things that I wanted to kind of point out from my memories of Repo Man. Number 1 is there is potentially a visual link between Repo Man and the case in Pulp Fiction.
Yes, absolutely.
You can tell that he's definitely inspired Tarantino. In some of those shots of the boot being opened in Repo Man, and then the case in Pulp Fiction. The other one that I wanted to point out is Harry Dean Stanton. Now, Harry Dean Stanton, to me, he stars in one of my favorite movies of all time, which is Paris, Texas. To me, he will always be Travis. And it's interesting with Harry Dean Stanton because it seems for ages he's been one of these actors who's been eternally old. It's like he's been old forever, but he's the coolest cat on the block. I mean, he is. There's just something about him that he has this air of coolness about him, and he appeals to such a younger generation as well. And he was in Paris, Texas.
So he was in Cool Hand Luke. He had an incredible career. I was fortunate enough. A few years ago, my wife took me to a screening, and they had a live Q&A via Skype with Harry Dean Stanton, where he was in his 90s, I think, but he was talking about his career, and it was just fascinating. My first introduction to him was as the dad in Pretty in Pink, right? And he kind of plays these broken characters that have a heart, that are immensely likable. And his character in Repo Man is just it's just fantastic because it's a kind of fatherly role, but it's like way out there. He plays a character called Bud, who's a repo man, and he's just got anytime he's on screen, Harry Dean Stanton is electric on the screen, and this for me is the greatest role of his career for me. I'm not, Paris, Texas withstanding, but I just love how cool he is, the delivery, as an actor, every time you see him, every time you hear him speak, you think it's real. So when he's being cool, and saying great dialogue, it feels completely authentic. And there's so many elements of dialogue that happens, and not just there's other characters. Like every character in this film is super cool. They could have been lifted out of Pulp Fiction, right? So that Tarantino reference is amazing. But Harry Dean Stanton is brilliant. And it needs him in that role.
Yeah.
And it really gives the film this kind of it elevates the movie. And Emilio Estevez's character, the way they kind of juxtapose each other is really like the chemistry is, they talk about on-screen chemistry. It just jumps at you. I mean, I honestly think Repo Man is like a really happy accident, because it made me want to watch more of Alex Cox's work, and it's a bit hit and miss, right? But that's the thing with, if you're a creative genius, and I think that Alex Cox has elements within him that, in 100 years' time, people will be talking about some of his work.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you've got to have some hit and misses. When I was at university in Manchester back in the 90s, I went to see a Q&A with Alex Cox, right? And I remember him, he gave me, I'm digressing, but it's interesting. Hopefully it's an interesting story. I walked away from that Q&A with Alex Cox with two really clear memories. Number one, he told me the story about how he's been in those meetings with the Hollywood execs where they green light your film, right? He's been there. And when you're a kind of 18, 19-year-old film student, you're like, you just laugh like that, right? You think, how could you ever get there? And the other thing he said, which I've carried through all the way through my life and career, is he said this, he went, never be mysterious about your ideas. It's BS. Like, just don't, just say what it is. Never, because like there's such a massive jump between an idea and manifesting it. Never be mysterious about it. I always kind of took that on board. But there's a really interesting story about how he got Harry Dean Stanton involved, and it's actually in this book, which is I picked this up at a secondhand bookstore in Brixton, 10 Films, and he talks about basically stalking Harry Dean Stanton, and he found out that Harry Dean always used to go to this one pizza place every Sunday to get some pizza, and he just waited there until he turned up. And when he turned up, he jumped and pitched him. And but I love stories like that. And you can tell,
and that's exactly what what I understand he did with Iggy Pop as well, to get Iggy Pop on the soundtrack. He basically knew Iggy Pop had a flat near the Whiskey A Go Go, and basically stalked Iggy Pop and ended up back in Iggy Pop's flat. And Iggy Pop said, because Alex Cox is really tall, he was almost like his head touched the ceiling, and he could not say no to Alex Cox. And it's funny with Alex Cox, because I always group Alex Cox in that kind of almost very artistic, very creatively genius filmmakers, but actually almost an enfant terrible in the same way that Tony Kaye is, or Philip Ridley. They've done great films, but actually haven't done very many, because by all accounts, they can be actually really difficult to work with.
So the first time we reached out to Alex Cox was when we were doing Search the Last Action Heroes, and I emailed him. I said, look, we're all huge fans. We'd love you to be in our documentary. And he just wrote back saying, thank you, but I've got no interest in talking about Hollywood films. Right? Because obviously there's so many of the action movies are Hollywood. And I thought it just made me want to try harder. And then when we did In Search of Tomorrow, which was about 80s sci-fi, we did cover Repo Man, and we got very close. We were talking about locations and times and stuff, and it just in the end the schedule didn't work out. I definitely want to go back a third and final time for Alex Cox when we do, because we're developing the sequel, In Search of Tomorrow Part 2 at the moment, and my final try to get him, because he does do interviews occasionally, but yeah, like he is that he is what you describe. He and you hear it in the book when you read about him. He's a nightmare to work with. And you could argue that the work that he's put out in the last 10 years hasn't landed.
Yeah.
But in his heyday in the 80s, he was that guy. And I think there's a generation of us where he will always be that guy. Like Repo Man has a global cult status.
Yeah.
And I do have a number two.
Yeah, so why don't we
about it.
move on to number two? So that's your first one. We went on tangents there, but I love a tangent.
Tangents.
So
Love
we're more
tangents.
done with that. So Harry Dean-Stanton is number one. What's number two?
Number two is I'm going to call it ambience, right? So what I'm really speaking about is LA, dirty LA in mid 80s. I'm including the soundtrack. So you've got Black Flag, the Circle Jerks are actually in it. The whole film is bathed in this kind of new wave LA punk fog, right? And it's so beautifully shot. And I was in LA last year, and it's not like that anymore. And I kind of miss it. And it's this times capsule, but although the movie is about crazy stuff and crazy stuff happens, it's grounded in this kind of indie filmmaking reality where they shot on location in the horriblest parts of Los Angeles, and it feels real, and it just jumps out of the screen at you. And so whenever I see this movie, and every couple of years I revisit it and I watch it, I always see something new. I always take something away from it. And on my most recent viewing, that's what I took away. I was like, wow, I'm time traveling back into this very cool era. And as an extension to that, one of the things that I find when I see this film is that you can't help but watch it, and at the end of it feel really cool, because you've been around all these really cool characters that are saying cool things, and the vibe is just like, it just hits that spot.
Fabulous. So third and final reason, Robin. What's the third reason why we should watch it?
Oh man, okay. So I was a very strong 1 and 2. Why should you watch Repo Man? Okay, I'm going to give you number 3. Dialogue, right? It is the coolest dialogue outside of Pulp Fiction, right? The scenes in the car, the relationship building between Bud and Otto. Harry Dean Stanton steals a show with some of his monologues. You can buy T-shirts with lines from this film. Like the dialogue and the evolution of the characters. There are no Doug characters. Even the background characters are really strong and memorable. And they all have a reality and a backstory, and it all feels very authentic, but it's all driven by incredible writing. And I don't think, there's a bit in the middle of the film where it kind of lags a little bit, but there isn't really any dialogue that's wasted. And all the casting and all the characters are so quirky in their performances that I think they could only have been that way anyway. And so it was cleverly cast. But again, it's the dialogue that drives all of this. And you can just listen to it, and it has moments of philosophy. It has moments of frustration. It has moments about the American nightmare, about commercialism. It has stuff to say on a socio-political level without taking itself too seriously. And it just tonally gets all of it right. So it's some of the best dialogue I've ever seen in a film.
So let's just jump back to Alex Cox for a moment, because one of the things that I've always been interested about Alex Cox, because like we said before, I discovered him on Moviedrome, and I was always interested with Alex Cox that he went from making Repo Man, which was, he's very much a cult classic, and then I believe his film after that is Sid and Nancy, and which is just an amazing turn from Gary Oldman. It really is electric from Gary Oldman. But after that, it's like something happened, and it's like almost he fell out of love with Hollywood, but he didn't fall out of love with film. And was it just the Hollywood filmmaking machine, that he just, he didn't like the politics, or he didn't play the game. And plenty of British directors have mentioned this. We mentioned before Tony Kaye, who had a huge falling out with Edward Norton during American History X. You got Stephen Norrington, who did his film debut. Well, he did. I think he did a film before it, but his Hollywood debut was Blade, and then he did League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and had a falling out, and hasn't really kind of recovered. Philip Ridley did The Reflecting Skin, which was hugely celebrated on the festival circuits, but his career didn't really kind of take off. Where do you think I don't want to say it went wrong for Alex, but it's almost like he hasn't fulfilled his promise of those two early films. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think that from my experience, limited experience and correspondence, and from what I've read and seen, I think there's a bitterness that he has, because he probably, whether he's aware or not, or doesn't care, he is revered. Like I've never met Alex Cox. If I met him, I would be a bit of a fanboy. And I don't care if he can be curt, abrupt, even rude. I actually kind of expect that. He was never going to fit in. These guys don't. That's part of the mythology, right? This is an Alex Cox film, and it's brilliant, and he was brilliant. And sometimes a flame burns very brightly for a short amount of time. You move on in life. To go off and make an independent film, honestly, it's got to be something wrong with you. You certainly don't do it for the money. Everything's against you, and yet, despite all of these setbacks, the studio changing, the leadership changing over, them wanting to bury this film, kind of 38 years on from its release, we are talking about it on YouTube, right? He made something really great, and it was a moment of time, and that's more than I have.
Yeah,
that's
exactly. And it's more than a lot of us.
No one's going to be talking about me in 100 years, but I think they will be talking about Alex Cox. And I think if you look at not just the body of work, but there is so much depth, there's so many layers to him, and he's inseparable from the work. He's such a character. There's a websites, plural, dedicated to Moviedrome, right? He is an actor as well. He is a character. He is a presenter, and he is absolutely unique. And from what I can gather, I think he was a film professor at I think maybe the University of Arizona or somewhere like that. And he probably wants to make movies, but sometimes you align with the zeitgeist. This movie absolutely aligned with the zeitgeist. Like, everything came together. It was a concept that brought all the mavens from the kind of LA punk scene together. It had just inbuilt credibility. Harry Dean-Stanton, Emilio Estevez was on the up. This amazing soundtrack, and it was like a genre film. Sometimes that magic is hard to replicate, and it's in a kind of nutshell, I think he's a fascinating character, and I think his story wouldn't be as fascinating if he'd gone on to be this huge Hollywood success. It's the fact that his star burned brightly and is kind of diminished that makes me appreciate the greatness of this film even a little bit more, because I don't see Alex doing something on this level ever again. He's probably quite old now. Must be in his 60s, maybe he's in his 70s now, right? But he had an impact. This little film, made a dent in the universe, inspired a whole generation of successful Hollywood auteurs. You can see that in so many different ways, and that's better than most of us do.
Robin, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. We're going to put all the links to all your documentaries, and I know you've told me about a very exciting one about aliens coming up, which a lot of the viewers of FilmFellas will be stoked to kind of find out more about. We'll have a huge amount of links in the description for Robin. But on behalf of FilmFellas, Robin, thank you so much for reaching out to us, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Loved it. I'm feeling buzzed.
Excellent.
Want to watch Repo Man? Want to watch Repo Man again?
Great stuff. Thanks a lot, Robin.